I agree. I think it should, at least certainly for this show, for purposes of this show, we should just assume that it was true in the sense that these people did see Jesus in some sense, in the way that 1 Corinthians 15 says, which is very vague on the details. And of course, the common view is that these were hallucinations or visions or dreams or something. And rather than get into that whole debate as to whether that was actually the case, I'd like to ask a sort of side question, sort of see where you are in the context of this whole debate, which has to do with not with that particular vision, or appearance, but other things that were going on in the church. And for example, in the book of Acts, the apostles are having vivid and powerful visions and dream communications from God all the time. We hear of similar experiences reported in that era from Jews and pagans, who are also having vivid and powerful visions and dream communications from a variety of different gods and angels. And so my question is how do you explain this? I mean, why isn't this happening now, today? And why was that happening back then, even to pagans and Jews who weren't seeing or hearing what the Christians were seeing and hearing?
Doc, I can jump in any time, but since you're my mentor, I'm going to defer to you on all this.
So, yeah.
Unless you want me to take something.
Well, go ahead, Mike. I don't want to be the only one speaking here, but Richard, if I understand your question, you're saying, A, why don't we see this today?
Right.
And B, what do we do with non-Christian accounts of visions and dreams and whatnot?
Yeah, exactly. And why was it so common back then across the spectrum of religions, but not today?
Let me make one comment on the second question, and then I'll let Mike jump in. I don't want to be the one dominating the discussion here. But, Richard, in New Testament scholarship, as you're probably aware, critics have actually been impressed of exactly the opposite, and the book of Acts is a case in point. When New Testament writers discuss the resurrection appearances of Jesus, this was recognized by a German theologian named Theodor Keim in his 3-volume Life of Jesus between 1867 and 1872 AD. My point is, 135 years ago, Theodor Keim, a critic, was saying that one of the interesting things about the resurrection of Jesus is that in the New Testament, the resurrection appearances are delineated. They're separated from all the other visions, dreams. They are not said to be the same thing. Now, that doesn't prove either one is true or false. It just proves if Keim's comment is true in virtually all of...
Right. That's why, that enters into a whole other debate about the Gospels and so forth. That's why I'm focusing just on what Paul says. Now, Paul doesn't say the things that the Gospels say specifically. He doesn't give us a narrative the way the Gospels do. So in interpreting Paul, just at this point, and even that, I don't want to focus so much on what you think Paul meant when he said Jesus appeared, but I want to try and understand how it is that you explain the frequency of these visions and so forth. These Christians were constantly having communications from God, these powerful visions, in a way that doesn't happen to Christians today. And at the same time, the Christians weren't the only ones experiencing this phenomenon. The Jews and pagans were as well back then. And I'm just curious to understand how you make sense of this.
But to me, if I were the critic, I would say, hang Acts 10, hang 2 Corinthians 12. I don't care about that stuff. I want to know, is the resurrection factual? I want to know if the resurrection occurred. Let's look at it from that viewpoint. If the resurrection of Jesus...
Yeah, I understand that, but I think that's the wrong... that kind of bracketing is problematic, because we're still facing...
It's not problematic for the New Testament writers.
Peter didn't have... If that vision wasn't really a communication from God, that means something very substantive for the interpretation of the resurrection, the interpretation of Peter's experiences, and so forth. It's very important. You can't... I don't see how a Christian
why is that important,
care about
Richard?
that.
Why is that important?
Yeah, I don't see where the...
Let's say, for example, that you believe... I'm not saying you do, but let's just say you believe that when Peter had that vision of the communication from God, that was just a normal dream and it wasn't really God talking to him. Well, now all the doctrine that followed from that vision is now no longer from God. So that a lot of all the stuff that fell from that was the abolition of the dietary requirements, for example.
Mm-hmm. But that's not what the early Christians were claiming about Jesus. They didn't see Jesus in dreams or visions like that. That is not the initial post-resurrection appearances. They were seeing him in bodily form.
At least not the way they're described in Acts, but what I'm trying to get at is not what the possible explanation for the resurrection appearances were. I mean, that's a related issue. But the thing is there's a whole phenomenon going on back in the ancient world of these kinds of people sincerely believing that God is talking to them, that angels and gods and so forth are appearing to them. Pagans, Jews, and Christians, this was happening all the time, and it's not happening now at all. And I think this is problematic. Well, what explains this change in the whole atmosphere of the world, really?
I would not concede that we don't see any phenomena today that might be supernatural.
Well, okay, let's. I mean, I disagree with a lot of what you said.
I'm sure you do.
Yes, you go around and around on that.
Yeah. Right. I'm just saying.
I want to try and stick to the one particular thing I'm trying to get at. And let's just assume, for example, that there are these genuine near-death experiences and so forth. And I've read some of the literature. Near-death experiences in India, for example, involve going to the Hindu heaven and interacting with Hindu gods. Now, how do you explain that? I make the distinction between what people actually saw and how they interpreted it. And of course, there are a lot of bodily resurrection stories among pagan literature. But
actually, there's not that precedes Christianity. And in fact, there's a new book, it just come out, I think it was 2001, 2002, by T.N.D. Mettinger called The Riddle of Resurrection. Now, this guy's a skeptic. He does not believe like most do. And in this book, he says that the consensus of scholarship today is that there are no dying and rising gods that predate Christianity. But he says, I'm going to take issue with that. And he goes through here and he says there's some new evidence, and he goes through and he says, I'm going to stand alone. And he says there are definitely 3, maybe 5, that predate Christianity. But then he goes back and he compares it at the very end. This guy's not a Christian. He compares it with Jesus. And he says, what about him? Is he a dying and rising God? And he says, yes, he is. But the difference, and he names a bunch of differences, and he says, so there's no a priori reason that we can think of why Jesus is of the same genre or a parallel to these other dying and rising
or that
gods.
that Christians borrowed.
No way.
That's a whole separate issue from what was acceptable in the culture. I mean, it's one thing to say that the Christians got the idea from someone else, but it's another one to say, and you guys haven't said it, at least not here, which is the idea that the pagans completely didn't accept the idea of a bodily resurrection. Those are two completely different arguments, or that pagans didn't interpret any appearances or experiences they had as of a bodily resurrection. I mean, those are completely different things.
Well, you got Aristeas, who's mentioned by Herodotus, but other than him, it's really difficult to find something that would sound like that.
Richard, did you say
there were any examples?
Well, they're all pretty different.
Did you say there were bodily resurrection accounts before Christ?
Well, there are some, yes, but
like what?
There's a ton of resurrection accounts that clearly could not have been inspired by Christianity, for example, regardless of their date.
Well,
but if you want a really comprehensive list of them,
well, just name one.
As I've been able to build.
No, what's a case for a non-Christian God who is raised from the dead, and we know the text is pre-Christian?
Well, believed to have been raised from the dead.
Well, that's fine. What's a good pre-Christian example?
The first example, of course, is Salmoxis.
That's not. He never died, or Salmoxis never even died.
You got to remember that's the unbelievers' explanation. That's like taking.
That's what Herodotus said.
That's like taking Celsus against the Christians and taking his interpretation of what the Christians were.
No, Herodotus himself said he never died.
No. Yeah, Herodotus is the unbeliever. He's talking about a foreign religion. He's talking about the Thracian cult, and he's basically attacking the Thracian cult, or at least disparaging it by coming up with a rational explanation for what they believe.
Okay,
but no, we want to talk about what the Thracians believed.
Well, let me read directly from Herodotus here. This is in History's Book 4, verses 95, 96. He says, Salmoxis made a hall where he entertained and fed the leaders among his countrymen and taught them that neither he nor his guests nor any of their descendants would ever die, but that they would go to a place where they would live forever and have all good things. So according to what Herodotus is reporting, Salmoxis reported, Salmoxis was saying that he and his friends would never die. You don't have a death, you don't have a resurrection.
Which is typical.
Well, but he goes on to say, though, doesn't he say that they presumed he was dead when he disappeared, and then he came back and they presumed he'd been returned to life? Well, right? That's what they believe.
Who?
The Thracians. I mean, Herodotus and the Greeks had their own little snide, rationalistic explanation about this trick he pulled. But
there he's saying
the Thracians didn't believe that the trick was pulled on them. If they did, they wouldn't believe the story at all.
Okay, but he's saying that Salmaxis is telling their guests that they and their descendants will never die.
He's recounting their beliefs.
Well, yes, but he's also talking. I mean, that's the same Pythagorean view regarding the soul never die.
Well, that's correct.
He's not talking about your physical body that you have right now is never going to die. I mean,
Richard, that's typical. That's typical of the Greek mind of that time. But that's not bodily resurrection. In fact, I would argue it's neither resurrection nor bodily. It's neither one. I mean, the whole Tom Wright argument for 500 pages is that you find virtually no case or no case of bodily resurrection. Now, one of the objections is, au contraire, there's all kinds of cases of ghosts and disembodied whatevers. Well, sure, they believe that. But his point is...
we don't, like I said, we could go forever on this.
But there's no case of bodily resurrection. No claim.
Go to Google and type in parentheses, was resurrection deemed impossible, with a question mark, and my name. And then you should come up with my fairly comprehensive list of all the bodily resurrection accounts. Not all of them predating Christianity, but even the ones that post-date Christianity are not inspired by Christianity. My question is, wouldn't the gospel have been so much more successful and so many more people been saved had Jesus appeared to everyone? Had he appeared to the Roman Senate, and the Roman Senate, passed a decree announcing the gospel, for example, and he appeared to the Chinese at the same time. Imagine the evidence we would have if at the exact same time, 30 A.D., there's an appearance of Jesus communicating throughout China.
Right.
The gospel.
Well, Richard, if that happened, I think you might come back and you'd complain then. Well, that's great. He appeared back to them all that time.
It doesn't matter,
but he needs to appear to me.
But what about the billions of Chinese that would have, gotten the gospel earlier, or the number of other people on? You can't say that there would be no more converts.
No,
if there was more evidence.
Richard, to me, there's an assumption on your part, and the assumption is something like this: God should seek to give empirical evidence to convince as many people as possible with the scientific, historical, and other kinds of data. Maybe that's not God's.
Just efficient.
Maybe that's not God's agenda.
I believe He would be morally obligated to do so in the way that I would. If I found the cure for cancer and I only revealed it in secret to 500 people, that would be immoral in my worldview, in my perspective. To me, if I found the cure for cancer, it needs to be announced as widely and as quickly as possible.
And Gary, for me, at least, I'll argue.
We're talking about something that's way more important than the cure for cancer. If I were convinced of what you were saying, that there was convincing evidence that the soul was leaving the body or surviving without the activity of the body, then I would no longer be a naturalist.
And you'd have to be a little more open to resurrection, wouldn't you?
Well, actually, what I would do then is I would re-examine my previous faith, which is Taoism.
Good.
Because I think Taoism is a better explanation than Christianity is of all the evidence.
But what I mean is...
And I might end up in other directions as well, but I don't think it necessarily pushes us towards Christianity. I agree with you that
resurrection
it would add to a case for Christianity.
But you'd have to be a little more open to resurrection than you were previously on this new evidence alone, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that was my point.
Yeah, I agree with
I appreciate you saying that.
All right, well, gentlemen, we are out of time, unfortunately. People in the chat room are saying, wow, too bad a conversation like this is going to take 3 hours, actually. But, appreciate it. Bearing with a novice like me who's totally unawares of a lot of these arguments. I really appreciate that. It's 9:03, ladies and gentlemen. Check out the Rational Response Squad. They are up next. And, in fact, check it out right now. It's primecast.com. Again, Gary and Mike Lacona, thank you very much for appearing on the program. And Richard Carey, thanks for sitting in as my special guest co-host. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. It was a good hour.
Great to be with y'all. Good to talk with you again, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.